Hello and welcome to Adoreum Conversations. My name is Andrew Thomas, and today I've got the great pleasure of chatting with a legend. He's the king of vitamins, the vitamin king himself, Patrick Holford. How are you, sir?
I'm feeling great.
Oh, you're feeling great. Where are you at the moment?
I'm in London.
You live in Wales as well, didn't you?
Yeah, I would prefer to be there. We have a farm, Forest Coal Pit Farm, just north of Abergavenny, tucked between Sugarloaf Mountain and the Llantoni Valley, where my son raises pigs, rare breed pigs. And we have a retreat center for people to come and get super healthy, but of course they're not allowed to come right now, so it's a bit quiet. And, you know, everyone's worried about 5G. Well, I don't think we've even got 0.5G, where we are.
I know, I spoke to you there.
Yeah, it's a bit, so we figured it would be better to go back to London, where we've got a lot of good internet connection, because during this pandemic, I've been sort of virtually all over the world, from China to South Korea to Japan to California, America, and so on. And you need a good Wi-Fi signal to do that.
Well, it's a really good signal, and you're looking fantastic and really well there. Can we just go back to your background, Patrick? You started as a psychologist or studied psychology. How did you get from that into nutrition?
I went into psychology because I was really interested in sort of the optimal human potential. You know, who are we? What's life all about? And all that kind of stuff. So yeah, as a teenager, I was reading, you know, Hermann Hesse and Jung, and looking into Tibetan Buddhism and, you know, Indian stuff and philosophy and all that kind of thing. And I then got very interested in the brain. And I kind of had two main focuses. One was intelligence. I thought that what the world needs is intelligence, you know. And I had a post recently on vaccines, and someone said, shame there isn't a vaccine against stupidity. I thought that would be good. And the other area I was interested in was schizophrenia, because 1 in 100 people suffer from this terrible condition. Many of them end up committing suicide. And if there was something that could be done, that would be really, really interesting. And then sort of two things happened. The first was the schizophrenia. I came across a randomized placebo-controlled trial giving a very high dose of niacin, vitamin B3, versus placebo to newly diagnosed schizophrenics, run by the research director of psychiatry in Canada. And the results were exceptional. And I remember showing it to my professor, and he said, oh, load of nonsense, vitamins, whatever. But, you know, we'd been taught to look at randomized placebo-controlled trials. I later learned, by the way, it was the first ever randomized placebo-controlled trial in the history of psychiatry. So
Where was this, Patrick? Where was this? Which university?
Well, it was in Saskatchewan. And it was very interesting. I actually jumped on a plane and went to meet Dr. Abram Hoffer, who was the head of psychiatric research. And the story goes back a little further. There was a British psychiatrist called Humphrey Osmond, and in the 40s and 50s. And he had a theory that what was happening in schizophrenia, by the way, Freud was big in those days. Everybody was talking about schizophrenic mother and whatever. And he had a theory that these people were actually hallucinating, that they were producing an endogenous hallucinogen that was making them see things, hear things, etc., 24/7. And he had a theory that it was something to do with adrenaline. And he got completely ostracized by the British psychiatric community and thought, fuck it, I'm off to Canada. And in Canada, he met this man, Abram Hoffer. Abram Hoffer was quite a genius, very bright man. I remember him telling me that when he had to go to school, he had to ride an hour on horseback. Right? He did very well in school. He became a genius chemist, and he ended up being a grain chemist. What else is there to do in Saskatchewan? Then went into medicine, then went into psychiatry. And what they did, and he became in charge of all of the psychiatric units in Saskatchewan. And they started to truly observe their schizophrenic patients, and they developed a scale of disperceptions. You know, disperception would be seeing something, hearing something, feeling your body is really large, or, you know, a whole lot. Have a very useful scale of disperceptions. And their logic was that the brain, the sensory system, is not processing information correctly. And then they made a genius discovery. I mean, this was very, very neat. They looked at all of these disperceptions and studied the literature. And what they found is they were incredibly similar to the Native Americans in North America when they consumed peyote, which is a hallucinogenic cactus. There were just, a lot of similar disperceptions. So they went off and collected blood and urine samples from the Native Americans on peyote, which is interesting.
High as a kite.
Yeah. And also blood and urine samples from the schizophrenics. And they found something that is always in the urine of somebody when they take peyote, and is in 73% of schizophrenics, but not in normal people. So they thought they'd found something chemically interesting.
Yeah,
and
correlation there.
Exactly. And to cut the story sort of quickly, what they then found was that adrenaline can be turned into something which they called adrenochrome that makes you hallucinate. And they worked out that chemically speaking, the antidote would be a large amount of B vitamins. And they had a patient who had catatonic schizophrenia who was basically dying. And in catatonia, you're like sort of as stiff as a board, you don't respond to anything. So they put a tube down his throat and poured in 2,000 milligrams of niacin. The RDA, which is the ridiculous dietary arbitrary, is 18 milligrams. So they put a very high dose of niacin, B3. And by the way, the classic deficiency of B3, which is called pellagra, are the 3 Ds, which is diarrhea, dermatitis, and dementia, or you start to go crazy.
Yeah.
So there is a link between B3 and craziness in extreme deficiency. Anyway, the guy completely recovered, both didn't die, and from his schizophrenia. So they set up the first ever, what they call double dummy trial, where when they got a new patient diagnosed with schizophrenia, every other one went on the niacin high dose versus the placebo, and they had a remarkable effect. So I flew out there and I met this man and I said, how many people have you treated with this, mega vitamin approach, which is completely new to me? And he said, around 3,000. And I said, what's your success rate? And he said, 85% cure. And I nearly fell off my chair. I said, I've never seen a cured schizophrenic. What is your definition of cure? And he said, free of symptoms, able to socialize with family and friends, and paying income tax. Now, I'd never seen a schizophrenic paying income tax, So my next question was, I want to meet some. And yeah. I hung around, I met about 12 people.
That's not when you came to Wales, though?
Not when I came to Wales, no. And sure enough, I met people diagnosed with schizophrenia who were as sane as you or I, whatever that might mean. And then I said, I've got one more question for you. Can I become your student? And which I did. And then there's one more part to this story, because a man brought his son to be treated. It came up from California, Carmel. His son was schizophrenic. He'd heard about Abraham Hoffer's research. And the son got better. And the father was so delighted, he bought 50 copies of Abraham Hoffer's book, went back to Carmel and gave one to every single doctor in the county. One of the doctors had invited to tea Dr. Linus Pauling. Now, at that point, Dr. Linus Pauling is the only man ever to have won 2 Nobel Prizes. He had 48 PhDs, mainly honorary. We can talk about him because he's an absolute genius.
I know.
He saw the book
about him.
Yeah, he saw the book and he borrowed it. In fact, I'm wearing a T-shirt. This is our campaign, change.org/vitamin C4UK. And the man on here is Linus Pauling. So Linus Pauling is the greatest genius in the world of chemistry. Albert Einstein was asked, are you a genius? He said, no, if you want a real genius, it's Linus Pauling. He is the father of molecular biology. He's the father of modern chemistry. He loved, this is the true mark of a scientist. He loved things that didn't fit. For example, everyone knew ether made you unconscious. Nobody knew how. So he sat down and thought about it and published a paper on the chemistry of unconsciousness. Isn't that a wonderful exam question? What is the chemistry of unconsciousness? And that's the birth of modern anesthetics. So throughout his life, he was doing things like that. But also, he was working with Einstein, and after Einstein died, took over his peace activism against nuclear bomb testing. And for that reason, he got It was McCarthy era. He got labeled a communist, which he wasn't. His passport was confiscated. He couldn't leave America. And he wanted to get to Oxford to meet Madeleine, the French scientist, who had some data that would give a clue to the structure of DNA. And Watson and Crick, Francis Crick and James Watson, were paranoid because they said, you know, if Linus Pauling gets his data, he's going to beat us. He's so bright. But anyway, he couldn't leave the country, couldn't get the data. And he guessed slightly wrong. Thus, they got the Nobel Prize. He didn't, but he would have.
He would have had three. He would have had three.
Exactly. And in fact, he deserves a fourth, because what happened was, when he got this book, and by then Abraham Hoffa was also using vitamin C, and we know that when you have scurvy, you develop hallucinations. Yeah. And I'll give you a lovely example of that, of a lady who's just come off a mechanical ventilator. And then he started to study vitamin C. And what he soon realized was every single animal makes it from glucose. It's basically existed. I mean, all of life is oxygen-based. So we are an oxygen-based life form. And since the beginning of oxygen-based life forms, there's always been vitamin C, which is an antioxidant. If you like, it mops up the exhaust fumes of an engine that runs on oxygen, which we do. So it's an incredibly old molecule that exists in, you know, all oxygen-based life forms, all of which make it, except for primates, the guinea pig, the Campibera, which are basically fruit-eating jungle rodents, a fruit-eating jungle bird called the red-vented bulbul bird, a couple of Amazonian fish, the Oscar ornamental fish and teleost fish. Everyone makes it, except for us. I mean, a goat makes 15 grams a day. 1 gram is 20 oranges. And if you expose a goat to a virus or to stress, they will increase their production up to 100 grams. And he just thought this was very interesting. He also was fascinated by the fact that you only need about 40 milligrams, which is half a lime or something, to prevent scurvy, where the collagen in the body breaks down, your teeth start falling out, your gums bleed. And by the way, people who develop scurvy inevitably die of pneumonia, right? So this is all going to be very relevant when we come to COVID-19. And, you know, you need a tiny amount, I mean, almost invisible amount. And yet that's 40 milligrams. You can give someone 100,000 milligrams, 100 grams, no toxicity. Now, he'd never seen that. I mean, in water, if you drink 10 liters of water in one go, you can die. So we're talking about many times less toxic than water, and incredibly vital to everything. So he's basically spent the last 39 years of his life studying vitamin C. And he noticed that animals that make it generally don't get viral diseases. And that's why right now, all our cats and dogs and sheep and goats and pigs and horses, and, you know, they're all exposed to SARS-CoV-2, you know, the coronavirus. They're all exposed. We're all exposed, but they don't get it. And he thought that was very interesting. And he also noticed that these animals don't generally get cancer. So, I mean, one of the chapters in my book, Flu Fighters, is why goats don't get colds. You know, have you ever seen a goat with a cold? Do goats get breast cancer, prostate cancer, colorectal cancer? You know, generally not. So he dedicated the last 39 years of his life to doing nothing other than studying vitamin C, its chemistry, its clinical effect.
So this guy, if people don't know him, he was the greatest chemist of his generation. Like you say, he won 2 Nobel Prizes.
Ever.
48, ever. Won 48 PhDs. I read, because I've been reading his book, and it's a great book, not his book, but his biography. Didn't he have a liver disease that he kind of helped cure himself or heal himself with vitamins? Did that come before or after he kind of got interested in?
No, I don't really know about that. I mean, sometimes, you know, the people who've tried to knock him, and by the way, if you're into science and you read his papers, they are just exquisite. You know, I mean, the chemistry is just exquisite. No, he died.
He lived for 30 years. He had this liver disease that, you know, the prognosis was pretty bad at the time, and he treated it. He basically gave his liver a chance to rest. So he cut out sugar, he cut out salt, he took a lot of vitamin D, I think it was, and C. And he did that for 14 years. And then he lived for another, you know, he lived 30 odd years after he had a bad prognosis.
Well,
your
you
60s?
tell me something I don't know, so I will certainly look that up. I mean, we know he died at 93 from prostate cancer. And by the way, we nearly had a falling out because I had got onto the link between milk and prostate cancer, which is now a very well-established link.
Yeah, and did he believe that?
No,
Did he believe it?
he was in the generation of, of having sausage and bacon and eggs and milk, and, milk's a good thing. So he didn't really go down, that route. And it was actually wonderful because I filmed him a few months before his death. And I remember, because I arrived there with my film crew, he was working on something which is only now really entering cardiology. And that was something called lipoprotein A. And it's quite exquisite. So we know that lipoprotein A is a very significant marker for cardiovascular risk. And it goes up when your vitamin C level is down. So there's a very strong link between vitamin C and cardiovascular disease. And I remember at the time, he was lying in his bed. He had this big illuminated magnifying glass and a stack of journals, and he was just studying. And I said, I'm going to need you in about 10 minutes. And, he said, how long for? It's about 45 minutes. So, he got up and, we got him in place. And he knew he was dying. I knew he was dying. And he gave this exquisite lecture quoting references, statistics, this, that, and the other. But it was rather tangential. He seemed to be going off on some, very bizarre tracks that made no sense to the topic. And I remember it as the director at one point thinking, I might have to just stop him and say, do you think we could get back to the lipoprotein A thing? But I'm,
Can't do that. It's Linus Pauling.
Exactly. And just as I was getting close to that sort of nervous moment of, doing that, he said, and the reason I tell you this, and he brought these three fascinating strands of logic together, and it all started to become crystal clear. And I'll tell you a little bit of it because it sort of shows you the genius of the man. But basically, when you're vitamin C deficient, your collagen breaks down. That's the intercellular glue that holds you together. So naturally, your arteries, exactly, wrinkles and stuff, naturally your arteries are going to, be at risk. And what the body does is it produces something called apoprotein, which attracts the fat, called a lipid, becomes lipoprotein A, which effectively sticks to the artery walls and repairs or thickens the weak spots. So in other words, he was claiming that, for example, during the winter in the Northern Hemisphere, when we run out of vitamin C, the body has an adapting process to thicken the arteries, which will stop you bleeding and dying from scurvy. But in the long run, it's going to be bad for you if you keep doing that.
Yeah.
And before he died, he looked me in the eye and he said, Patrick, follow the logic. Don't worry about the randomized placebo-controlled trials. They come later. Just follow the logic. And that's what he did. And I remember in the 80s, I flew out to California and volunteered in a group that was working with people with AIDS, HIV, who were all, terminal. So there are groups of these people who were effectively going to die. And there was a lovely place called the Center for Attitudinal Healing. And then, for better or worse, I came across a few people who'd had crashing T cell counts and Kaposi's sarcoma, which is the cancer that occurs, and were now completely better. Their T cell counts had normalized, their Kaposi's sarcoma had gone, they were great. And in those days, in the sort of late 80s, the idea was if you're HIV positive, you will get AIDS and you will die.
Yeah.
And so what Linus Pauling did with two very, very brilliant immunologists is they took human T cells, which are the cells that get the HIV infection, saturated them in different levels of vitamin C to prove that the cells it was non-toxic to the cell, and then infected the cells with HIV, and then measured the viral replication, which is done by something called reverse transcriptase, and showed a 99.8% inactivation of the HIV virus with vitamin C. They then repeated the study, but this time comparing it to cells saturated with the best drugs available, like AZT. Yeah. And the vitamin C was about 10 times more effective than the best drug available. So they then applied for a multi-center trial to actually do this not on human cells, but on human people. and got the funding from the National Institute of Health. And they worked on this for about 5 years. It was a completely robust design. And about 3 months before the trial was due to start, the funding got pulled. And to this date, we don't know. So you know, in science, you look at an association. You know, do people with low vitamin D have more deaths from COVID? Secondly, you look at a mechanism. You know, how could this work? And then you run a clinical trial, ideally with a placebo group and so on. And, you know, since the 80s or even possibly before, every time the association is there, the mechanistic explanation for it is there, then you just get to the point of clinical trial and then it gets killed. You know,
do you know how much it would cost, Patrick, to do those trials? Do you have any idea how much?
Well, I've spoken to, you know, top scientists. I mean, one of my favorite is a man called Professor Harry Hemmeler. He's professor of public health. He's both a doctor and an epidemiologist and professor of public health. And he said it's not really, you know, it's not really necessarily the cost, you know, that holds these things back, because also we're talking about non-toxic substances. Vitamin C is dirt cheap. So there's not a lot of ethics, you know, to get through. There's not a lot of downside and all the rest of it. So, but for some reason it gets, you know, these things, I mean, that was a multi-center trial that would have cost quite a lot of money, but it's a good question, you know, why don't these things get done? I mean,
something to explore, isn't it? Because like, you know, I've been watching The Last Dance, you know, the Michael Jordan documentary, and I can remember, and Magic Johnson's on it, who famously was the first kind of big celebrity, really, who came out and said he had HIV. He was HIV positive. He looks amazing now. I mean, he looks better than Michael Jordan, and he's older than Michael Jordan. So I'm not sure. I wonder what his, you know, his thoughts are on vitamins and.
Well, I'm sure, you know, the top athletes, you know, are usually well plugged into this because their advisors, they know. I mean, I last night I was looking at, I went on the Bill Gates vaccine private blog group just for fun, you know, just to see what was being said in that area. And I looked at a picture of Bill Gates. I'm 62, he's 65. And my God, he looks bad, you know, for 65.
Poor Bill.
Well, I mean, I just thought, God, he's, you know, he's quite aged. But anyway, that was just a sort of, you know, not saying anything about Bill this way or that. It was just an observation. But it was quite funny because I blogged a couple of things about, you know, vitamin C, you know. And for those of you who don't know it, vitamin C, I mean, if you could look at the immune system and make a list of everything you could want a drug to do, you know, boost T cells, macrophages, you know, enhance the immune system, make interferon, block the virus's spikes. You know, there's a lot of talk about that. Be anti-inflammatory, antioxidant. You know, if you set out and just said, if we had a perfect drug that could do 12 things that we know affect viruses, what have we got? And the answer is, you've got vitamin C. It absolutely does them all. So anyway, I blogged a little bit about vitamin C, and I'll share two of the comments because it kind of shows where it's at. One lady said, vitamin C is nonsense. You only need it for scurvy. And anyway, high doses are dangerous. They give you loose bowels or diarrhea, she said, and gastric disturbance and headaches, which was a new one on me. And then she said, and they interfere with the contraceptive pill. So, Mr. Holford, you're going to have a lot of lockdown unwanted babies on your conscience, she says. And I responded and said, I'd love to see your science on the contraceptive pill and the headaches because it's new for me. And by the way, I might suggest that if you are suffering from a potentially life-threatening viral infection, it could be wise to abstain from having sex.
Don't tell David Tabasol that.
Another doctor writes in and said, vitamin C, load of nonsense, doesn't do anything. And by the way, you know, the days of scientific analysis and evidence are over. Everyone needs the vaccine. And I wrote back and said, that's a very, very big statement, you know, coming from a doctor. So we don't do any scientific analysis on vaccines. I mean, you know, is that what you're saying? Anyway, but the point is, I mean, I have to tell you that on Tuesday, I started feeling really tired.
I know. I spoke to you, and I got to say,
yeah,
we are going to talk about COVID-19 because obviously we're in a pandemic. But I spoke to you. You sounded awful.
Yeah.
I thought Patrick Holford's coming down with it. What's going on?
Yeah, no, on Wednesday I felt, you know, even more tired, a bit achy. And then Wednesday evening, suddenly, wham, all my muscles are aching. I've got a splitting headache. I've got mucus, like sinus. You know, my ears are hurting a bit. My throat's hurting a bit. And, you know, I'm definitely under major viral attack. You know, this is a flu, whether it's COVID-19, I don't know. But so what I did, which is what I always do, and it's also what Linus Pauling did, is I started to take the equivalent of 1 gram an hour of vitamin C plus zinc.
So a tablet form, or do you drink that?
Either.
It'd be interesting for people watching this to know what you do.
I'm a little biased because I formulate things and other people make them. So I've got something called Immune C, and it has vitamin C and zinc in it. Not a lot of zinc. It's like 3 milligrams of zinc and 1,000 milligram of vitamin C. But if you take 20 of them, you're up to 60 milligrams of zinc, which is the amount that has a very strong antiviral effect, plus 20 grams of vitamin C. I also have a powder with the same thing. So actually what I did, because obviously what happens is when you're really sick, you can barely move. So you need to be prepared. So I've got a juicer, and I juice ginger. So I make a whole pot of ginger juice, and I pour it into ice cube trays. So cool. In my fridge, at any one point in time, I've got 20 ginger ice cubes. And also for the hell of it, I do the same thing with lime or lemon juice. And so what I would do is stagger down to the kitchen, put the kettle on, get a cup, put in a teaspoon, which is about 5 grams of vitamin C, heaped teaspoon. I put in a shot of this blueberry concentrate, just for taste, but the blueberry is good too, called Blueberry Active. Pop a ginger ice cube and a lime ice cube, pour in the hot water, and sip that.
Toddle up to bed.
Yeah, go off to bed and have that over the next sort of 4 hours or so. And what I've learned is that if you do that from the very beginning of an infection, it's incredibly rare for the infection to last more than 24 hours. So what happened for me, I've also got a temperature, by the way. So I'm sweating, temperature, aching, etc. You know when you're under attack.
Yeah.
And then, so that really started at 6 p.m. on Wednesday. And then by noon on Thursday, suddenly it's over. You know, you can feel it. It's very clearly over. And what I find almost inevitably is just before it ends, and it usually ends pretty rapidly, you get a sort of sweat. You know, there's this last kind of burst of sweat, and wham, temperature goes down. Remember, the increased temperature is your immune system fighting.
Kicking in.
Yeah. So, you know, and then of course, so that's an 18-hour process in that case. I felt a little shaken but not stirred, you know, for the next few hours. And by the next morning, I'm feeling, you know, I think I said to you 98%. Today I'm feeling 100%. And I'm no longer taking, you know, the high dose vitamin C. So my drink this morning will give me this is called Get Up and Go, will give me 1 gram of vitamin C. So
how many do you take? So many things I want to ask you, Patrick, but
here is what I take. I'm showing you. What's in here is this oily thing is omega-3 and a little bit of omega-6. The purple thing is vitamin C, which also contains what we call black elderberry and zinc. And the sort of yellowish thing is a multivitamin and mineral, very high in magnesium. And this thing here is phospholipids, called brain food, very good for the brain. Now, normally I will take 2 of those a day, so that will give me 2 grams of vitamin C. Now, I don't want to take those 2 grams at the same time because it's water soluble and it's in and out in 6 hours. So it's completely the opposite. There is vitamin D in there. Now, what happens is in this, I've got 1 gram of vitamin C plus most of those nutrients. So I don't need this and this. So I've had this for breakfast, and I'll have this for lunch or for dinner. Now, vitamin D stores. So you don't actually need to take vitamin D every day. I mean, in essence, it's made in exposure to sunlight. So if you get out a lot and you work outdoors, and ideally, you don't live as north as we do, but if you live on the equator, you're going to make enough vitamin D. You don't need to supplement it for sure. There's not a lot in food. There's a bit in mackerel. Oily fish is the best source. But basically, you can, rather than taking it every day, you could take it once a week, 7 times the dose, just as good, because it stores. Yeah. So there are a lot of studies on pneumonia, for example, where I'm thinking of one just to illustrate the extreme end of this. These were people mechanically ventilated with pneumonia, and they were given, normally if you go to a health food shop, they have 1,000 IU of vitamin D, which is a good general guideline. Take 1,000 IU every day, or certainly throughout the winter would be good. Well, they gave these people 500,000 IUs, all right? 100,000.
Intravenous. Can you do that?
No. Oral. I guess they did. Yeah, absolutely. It would need to be intravenous because they're on a mechanical ventilator. So yeah, I guess they must have done it like that. But they were giving 1,000 IU a day, and for 5 days.
500,000.
They gave it 100,000 IU a day for 5 days.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So a total of 500,000. Very high dose. These were all people who had low blood vitamin D. And what happened is it halved their recovery time. So it halved the number of days they spent in hospital. And it increased their blood level of vitamin D, which was below 50, which is deficient, to above 100, which is probably optimal. So the only reason I'm saying this is that what you want with vitamin D is to have your levels certainly above 75, ideally at 100, and keep it there. So, and it stores. So
just top it up, depending on your level.
So there's no point, for example, my vitamin C pill does not have vitamin D in it, because there's no point of having vitamin D every hour during an infection. All you need to know is you've got enough in your system
to cover you.
Now vitamin C is completely different. It's water soluble, and you therefore need to have it frequently. And what we now know, and I think this is terribly important discovery, is that my colleagues in America who are working in intensive care units treating COVID-19 patients, and by the way, having zero deaths. No,
I saw the Senate committee report, and I watched it live when you told me about it. It's amazing.
Yeah. They are using intravenous vitamin C plus steroids and anticoagulants. We can talk about that. But they've been measuring their vitamin C level in their ICU COVID-19 critically ill patients, and every single one has scurvy levels of vitamin C, every single one without exception. Most of them have undetectable levels of vitamin C. So the point is, even the critics who say the only function of vitamin C is to prevent scurvy, which is a very, very old school way of looking at vitamins, like the only purpose of vitamin B3 is to prevent pellagra, are actually the medical treatment of scurvy is intravenous vitamin C. So, and to make this sort of interesting, I had a lady contact me. She spent 10 days on a mechanical ventilator and in a coma. And, then when they took out the tube, she's kind of hallucinating orange juice. This is what was happening. She was lying there hallucinating orange juice. It reminded me of Captain Haddock crossing the desert, hallucinating, the bar or whatever it is. But she was literally hallucinating orange juice. And they brought her, because she couldn't speak, because she had the ventilator, and they brought her a whiteboard. She just wrote, orange juice, And after 4 days, one of the nurses actually gave her a squeeze, of orange juice. And she was hallucinating that the fridge in the ward that she was in was full of cartons of orange juice. She was absolutely convinced that was the case. Anyway, she's now back home. She's doing very, very well. But the penny didn't drop for her. But her whole system was saying,
vitamin C,
orange juice, And the crazy thing is, it's like, there's so many randomized controlled trials, placebo-controlled trials, which you then pull together to have meta-analysis. This is the gold standard of science, showing faster recovery from pneumonia, less time on mechanical ventilators, less time in ICUs. And of course, the usual criticism. What happens if you look at the vitamin C studies is kind of interesting in a way, because and I'll illustrate this with the most recent British randomized placebo-controlled trial. So what happened was they're taking 2 tablets a day of either placebo or vitamin C. And at the end of the trial, which was across a winter, those on taking the vitamin C had a third less actual number of colds. Right? Now, a third less, depending on the size of your study, and this was only, I think, 150 people, was on the borderline of statistically significant. A very clear trend, but you could say it could have just been chance, right?
Yeah.
So the next thing they looked at was number of days of having a cold. So I could say, for example, I've had 2 days, of, possibly 3 days of symptoms. And then those taking the vitamin C had half as many cold days. And then the next question would be, how many severe symptom days did you have? So in my case, I would say I had 1 severe symptom day and possibly 1 either side. And then it became very statistically significant. Now, what happens in a meta-analysis is they chuck all the studies, together that may have a variable dose from 0.5 gram to 5 grams, whatever it happens to be. And you'll hear this line quoted so often: you don't get a lesser number of colds. Some people say, but you do get less severe colds, and you do get a shorter duration of colds. Now, if you get a cold for 7 days and 4 of them are severe versus 3 days and 1 of them are severe, as far as you're concerned, that's close to a cure. So that's what actually happens. But and by the way, the man whose study is quoted as the Cochrane Review 2013 by Professor Harry Hemmeler. And if you actually read the study, the BBC did a piece saying vitamin C, load of nonsense, and the lady quoted the sentence in the abstract, which is the summary, that says you don't get a less number of colds. And
you get exposed to a virus, you're going to get the cold, aren't you? And then obviously you just want to cut it.
Exactly. I said, well, if you actually go 2 sentences down, it says, but in studies with 6 or 8 grams taken in the first day of an infection, you then get a statistically significant effect. And one 8-gram study showed that 46% of people had no symptoms at the end of 24 hours. Now, what hasn't been done yet, which I would really love, and of course, the perfect large-scale study, is to give people a handful of pills. They don't know if they're placebo or vitamin C. And on the first incidence of symptoms, to take 1 pill an hour until you have no symptoms, because that's actually what works. That's what Linus Pauling did. He worked out that the RDA for vitamin C, which has many other effects, is very protective for cardiovascular health, should be 2 grams, which is what I take. There's a lot of other benefits of vitamin C. And then coming back to the lady on Bill Gates' blog who said, you get diarrhea. Now, if I take 8 grams today, I will get diarrhea. But over the time that I was sick, I probably took, up to 30 grams over 20 or so hours.
Your body absorbed it, you said to me, didn't you?
Absolutely no bowel effects at all. And to be honest, even if you did have to visit the loo a little bit more, if it kills something that could kill you, that would make a big difference. So we've now sort of introduced the 3 stages. One is, what do you do to keep your immune system healthy? Vitamin D, vitamin C, zinc. What do you do if you actually get an infection?
Ramp it up.
And then the final thing is, what do you do if you're critically ill and potential life-threatening? Now the point is, if you take the middle group, if we could instill in more of the public's consciousness what to do when you get an infection with vitamin C, then those people will not convert into the critically ill. Now, the criticism of all this right now is there's no evidence for vitamin C in relation to COVID-19, which of course is true for everything. It's just too short.
Yeah.
I mean, even the guys in America, this is called the Frontline Critical Care COVID-19 Critical Care Group. These are professors of critical care who spend their entire life in ICUs saving lives. And they worked out, they were the guys who ran the scurvy thing. They worked out something that is a really interesting story. We've known for many years that the adrenal glands store very large amounts of vitamin C. And when you stimulate the adrenal gland with stress, they actually secrete vitamin C into the bloodstream at a level 100 times the normal vitamin C level. So in a sense, you could think in this context that vitamin C is actually a hormone that is secreted under conditions of stress. Now,
is that doing good for you or bad for you?
Well, it's very good. I mean, I'll sort of explain this. I was involved in a car crash some years ago. Car was all smashed up. Police came along and they picked me up and said, where do you want to go? I said, well, I was actually going to dinner with some nice people up the road. If you could drop me there, I'd be very grateful. And I went there and we had a very nice dinner, and I was, shaken but not stirred. And later on that evening, suddenly, wham, my body had clearly had a big hit. Yeah. But what allowed me to function in that moment is my body's adrenal hormone, particularly cortisol. So we've got a fight-flight mechanism. And when you're under, it's not the virus that kills people, by the way. In the last stage, you get what they call a cytokine storm, where the immune system overreacts. It's like it's gone into total panic mode. And it causes this massive fever.
And it can't stop. It can't stop.
It can't stop. It's the same as septic shock or septicemia, which is normally induced by a bacteria. I had that in February as well. Very interesting year. I'll tell you a little bit about that. But basically, what the scientists had found was that, this is sort of debatable, that steroids, what you need when you're in this final stage for both COVID-19 and septicemia, is steroids. That is drugs that mimic cortisol. And they're usually called prednisolone. So, you've heard of asthma sprays, which have cortisol, steroids, eczema creams that have steroids. So the ICU guys say that steroids make a very big difference. And there's criticisms of that. But what happens is that it seems the steroids work with vitamin C. And when you get to the point of scurvy, when you've got no vitamin C, the adrenals can't function, your body stops fighting and you die. So I asked the Chinese have been doing a randomized controlled trial on vitamin C for people on mechanical ventilators. And I said, what are most people dying from? And they said, frailty. So there is a point where the body just quits. It can't fight anymore. And that's part of the adrenal response. So what the Americans learned is that if you give 3 grams of vitamin C intravenously every 6 hours, so 12 grams straight into the bloodstream over the day with steroids, they also use anticoagulants because you get a lot of clotting in the lungs. They have not had a single death. Well, I spoke to one, he'd had 50 patients, and he said, I've actually had 2 deaths. One was an over 85-year-old who had end-stage liver cirrhosis, and the other was an over 85-year-old who had end-stage lung disease. But he said they did bring me one person who'd had a heart attack and died and came into our ward dead, and we did it anyway, and they came back to life. So they said we've had 1 resurrection and we've had 2 deaths out of 50. And I spoke to another guy, Joseph Varon in Texas, and he's had, of his first 50, not a single death.
Patrick, why aren't we, or are we, because we've talked about this in Wales, and I've written 4 times to the health minister. He's busy, obviously, at the moment. But what I can't understand is you can go into Harvey Nicks and pay £80 and get intravenous vitamin C. And my friend just come off, he wasn't on a ventilator, but he was on oxygen for 5 days. And they didn't even mention vitamin C to him.
No, it's...
Why? I just don't understand why they're not doing it.
It is crazy, because I know there's this sort of, the black box thinking, a plane crashes, you get the black box, you find out what's going on, it gets investigated, you sort it out. And we just don't seem to have that. So there is this absolute block. And, while on the one hand, I love the NHS, on the other hand, I hate the NHS. In a sense, I sometimes call it the fastest growing failing business in Britain. Because it costs...
You're not talking about the frontline staff. You're talking about the the
I'm
bureaucracy,
talking about
the system.
I'm talking about the system, because the point is, it's like, you know, we know that there's 2/3 as many deaths in men as there are in women. We know there are 2/3 as many diabetics as there are, you know, in men as there are in women. We know that in Britain we've got 4.3 billion diabetics. We've probably got over 6 million diabetics and pre-diabetics. We've got a population of 65, 66 million. So we have allowed our nation to get to the point where, and by the way, you know, this is once, you know, it's age related. So, you know, we've got at any point in time, almost 1 in 10 of our population with a totally preventable, this is, you know, diabetes has two kinds, type 1 and type 2.
Yeah, type 2 is preventable.
Yeah, and there's 98% of diabetes. And we have allowed our, to get into this terrible state. And of course, it's these people who are at very high risk. And by the way, sugar, because vitamin C is made in animals from glucose, sugar and vitamin C share the same transport systems. So there's an awful lot of what's going on in diabetes is actually to do with the inability to use vitamin C properly. So if you give vitamin C to diabetics, their blood sugar stabilizes, their HbA1c comes down, their insulin response becomes better. So there's a very strong link between diabetes and vitamin C. But the point is, and I mean this in all the sort of best possible way, but you know, the medical profession have to take responsibility for the fact that we have created a nation where almost 1 in 10 have prediabetes or diabetes, which is a preventable disease. 10 years ago, or maybe a bit more. Yeah, I've got a few books here. Say No to Diabetes, okay? So I wrote
Patrick,
this book.
you know, I want to talk about that because what you talked about years ago when you wrote that book, now it's common knowledge. You know, the papers are saying you can reverse diabetes, there's programs on it.
Yeah.
Well, everybody called you, not everybody, certain parts of the press would call you crazy for saying that.
Absolutely trash.
Everything that you seem to have said, you know, we're talking about the gut health. I know you wrote a book on gut health, and I'm a massive believer in that. And I've read this book called The Plant Paradox. I don't know if you've read it, by Dr. Gundry. He talks about how you can, you know, get your gut bacteria back to normal and healthy. But everything you seem to have said, which is pretty much common sense when you know all about the vitamins and the body, is been proven right, isn't it?
And it's about a 10-year lag. Yeah. So this was 2011, and it's totally science-based. And to give you an idea of this, type 1 diabetes, where you lose the ability to make insulin. So one guy who followed the advice in this book with type 1 diabetes reduced his insulin dose by 75%.
So you can't cure type 1, but you can make it a lot better. Are you saying?
That's where it gets very interesting. I'll answer that in just 1 second. I went on GMTV. I said, give me a diabetic. And they gave me a diabetic, and who was taking a double dose of metformin, which is the normal dose. Yeah. And the diabetes specialist said, to this patient, if you can get your blood sugar below 6 for a week, 7 readings, I'd be willing to halve your drug dose. Okay. So what I said to her is, right, you're going on my low glycemic load diet, which stabilizes your blood sugar, less carbs, the right carbs. I gave her a vitamin strip, plus a mineral called chromium, which is very important because chromium makes the insulin receptor work properly. And I said, every day you're walking for half an hour. So, those were the 3 essential changes. And in 3 days, her blood sugar was below 6. So we waited another 7 days. On the 10th day, she halved her drug dose. Her blood sugar didn't go up. So on the 17th day, stopped her metformin.
Stopped it or halved it?
No, halved it after 7 days at 6. So halved it on day 10, stopped the other half on day 17. And I'd said to GMTV, I need 6 weeks. So she came back in 6 weeks, and we measured her glucose and also something called HbA1c. And basically, she'd been diabetic for 13 months. And at the end of 6 weeks, there was absolutely no test, no symptom, no anything that would have any GP diagnose her as diabetic. I thought they would be very excited about this, but I got trashed, by a doctor Hilary Evans was on holiday, so unfortunately this other lady came in. And as you say, they said there's absolutely no way, this was 10 years ago, that you can that you can reverse it. You can, it's under control or something.
Yeah.
But now we understand that you can. So here's an interesting thing. Type 1 diabetes, you lose the ability to make insulin. Now, if you think about the logic of this, if you eat less carbs, your body needs to make less insulin to take the sugar out of the blood. So following the same diet for a type 2 diabetic, a low GL diet, would be good for a type 1 diabetic.
Yeah.
With the proviso that you have to do this in a stage way because you're going to have to reduce your insulin dose. Right? Now, you still have receptors for insulin, like the docking ports. So if you get the receptors working better, which is what the mineral chromium does, you're going to need even less insulin. And we give chromium to both type 1 and type 2 diabetics, but with type 1, you have to do it in a staged way because otherwise their drug dose is too high and they get a hypo. So that's why. Now, here's where it gets very interesting. And this is, very much front edge, and I'm sure I'll be criticized for this. But the cutting edge of nutrition right now is that there's a process. The body has two fundamental operating systems. One is growth. And when you're eating a lot of carbs, that's what it does. And that's why we're growing. And we have all the growth-related diseases. Cancer is a growth-related disease. And the other is repair. And when you starve, so if, imagine in the old days, it's winter and you've run out of food, you've run out of berries and everything else, and you're kind of fasting. Your body switches on a process called autophagy, which is a self-repair process. You start to gobble up all the damaged cell parts, damage energy factories. Now, there's been a lot of research on autophagy, and we now know there are 20 factors that will stimulate autophagy, one of them being vitamin C. So I did I actually worked out a 5-day diet that has no carbs, low calories. Someone said, is it Atkins? It's high, you have fat. I said, no, it's definitely not Atkins, because when you eat meat and milk tells you to grow. That's why there's the link with prostate cancer.
Which is why I think and I know about this because my lovely ex had cancer 20 years ago, and I read about the the hormones in milk, and I went vegan then for quite a while, So you beat Linus Pauling on that one. I think.
I mean, there's nothing wrong with milk. The purpose of milk is to make babies grow. All animals consume milk, and once the infant is large enough, they stop. It's called breastfeeding. We're the only animal that continues to consume breast milk. If I said to you, I'm 62 years old, I'm still breastfeeding, from another species of animal, I mean it's not actually part of our evolutionary design.
No, I agree.
I won't get heavy on milk, but the point is that milk tells the body to come out of autophagy repair. So in other words, if I go on a fast but I have milk, I will not switch on autophagy. So we've learned how to eat a very specific, around 800 calories. So it's a sort of semi-fast, not too much protein, no meat, no milk.
For a few days.
Just for 5 days. I mean,
the
great. Book actually comes out on end of this month, the 5-day diet. So I took a group of people down to Wales, and we did this, and we ran.
I'm coming on the next time. I'm coming on that one.
Oh, fantastic. We ran blood tests and all the rest of it. But anyway, the point is, when they did this 5-day process on animals who had type 1 diabetes, so they did the diet for 5 days, 9 days off, 5 days, and they did it 4 times. The animals started making insulin again, right? So it reversed type 1 diabetes. Actually, what happens is your body makes these things called stem cells, which are like the very base cellular material. They started to remake the cells in the pancreas called beta cells, which then started to make insulin. So right now there's a human trial going on using this process to see if it can reverse type 1 diabetes. Now, one of the lovely things about this conceptually is at one end, you've got a bunch of people who haven't even bothered to check the scientific literature for the 10,000 studies on vitamin C, including tons of randomized controlled trials. We're talking about 50 years of studies on vitamin C. They just haven't even bothered to check it, because somewhere in their mind is this idea, vitamin C, it's a load of rubbish. You just need to eat an orange and not get scurvy. And then at the other extreme, we're into this completely evolved biochemistry, the leading edge of medicine, where we have someone like Professor Thomas Seyfried at Harvard Medical School, who's getting brilliant results with a virtually untreatable brain cancer called glioblastoma, using this diet plus lots of vitamin C. We've got other studies going on possibly reversing an autoimmune disease, which I'm sure if I wrote a book about this right now and went on telly, they'd hang, draw, and quarter me yet again.
Which disease? I mean, there's a book I've read that most diseases are autoimmune disease, aren't they? I've got, a slight case psoriasis and what's your thoughts on autoimmune disease and gluten as well? What do you think about that?
Well, I remember having a doctor with rheumatoid arthritis when you have the measured factors that identify that you've got rheumatoid arthritis, and I told them what to do. And after a year, they no longer had any rheumatoid arthritis. They no longer had any blood tests that show. So the conventional view is, autoimmune, it's irreversible. But we are seeing a very big increase in autoimmune disease. And the point is here that the genes haven't changed. If you think of the genes as the software and what you take in as the hardware, and the biggest part of what you take in that you can at least control is your food, if the genes haven't changed, then what is it that's causing the increase in these problems? Now, what Linus Pauling did, this is another of his 100 discoveries, was he proved how a gene causes disease. So he's the first person to show how a gene can cause disease. And he then went on to show how the environment can change genetic expression. So let's take something like the BRCA, the breast cancer gene. So everyone's heard the BRCA gene. And they go, oh my God, if I've got the BRCA gene, I'm going to die of breast cancer. And the reality is that half of people, approximately, who have the BRCA gene die of breast cancer, and half of people don't. So then the question is, well, what's different between the two? In the same way that we have, 95 or maybe 98% of people who get COVID-19 flu, have somewhere between a mild to unpleasant flu and get over it. And then there's this small percentage of people, who die. So my view is we need to very quickly find out how we identify those at risk, and we've got the data to do that, and then protect them.
Of course,
definitely. The entire game changes if at the ICU end this is a non-fatal disease. So the fear that everyone has is, oh my God, if I get this, I'm going to die. That's the fear. But as Professor Ioannidis, the professor of public health at Stanford University, worked out, actually, the risk in an under 65-year-old who doesn't have diabetes or heart disease is the same as the risk of death if you commute 10 miles to work and back every day. And that would then, it has to change public health policy. And my view is if we did all three things. On the one hand, we sort out, it's very obvious. You come to the end of this and you look around ICUs and you go, who's done the best?
Yeah.
And then you say, well, what have they done? And then you do the same thing. So if we get ICUs super efficient, during most of this pandemic, our risk of death for somebody entering an ICU was around 50%. The risk of death, 67% were leaving mechanically ventilated, were leaving dead. That's now reduced to about 50%. In China, when they did a randomized placebo-controlled trial, there's almost unethical now on mechanically ventilated people, either given 24 grams intravenously vitamin C or sterile water. They reduced the death rate from 35% on placebo to 24% on vitamin C. That was not with steroids. That was a third reduction. That's 24% versus what we had, which was 66%. So sort out what's happening in ICUs, because this doesn't really need to be fatal. Educate people about what to do when you get an infection. I had no fear of this, because I've had 40 years, I've had flu, I've never not got over it. So I have no fear of it because I have the experience of it working. And then identify, it's very simple. I mean, for example, if you do from the NHS database, and maybe you have the same in Wales, you ask 5 questions. 1, are you over 65? Yes or no. 2, do you have diabetes? Yes or no. 3, do you have cardiovascular disease or high blood pressure? Yes or no. 4, do you eat less than 3 servings of fruit and veg a day, and also don't take vitamin C? Either of those. And 5, is your blood level of vitamin D, which a lot of people have had measured, below 50. So what's the risk if you say yes to all of those versus no? And that sort of factor analysis would very quickly show us that actually there's this small group of people at risk, and those are the people who we need to protect.
Yeah, like in the care homes. I mean, do you think they are giving people vitamin C in the care homes?
No. I mean, you see, the terrible thing is none of this is truly based on science, but as you've heard, vitamin C is dirt cheap. I mean, the cost in China, they shipped in 50 tons on the 2nd of February. And by the way, I was just looking at a report in the Journal of American Medical Association this morning on a study in Wuhan. And even though they didn't mention the vitamin C in it, they said the cases started to fall very sharply after February the 1st. They shipped 50 tons in on February the 2nd, which is 50 million grams. They gave it to hospital workers. They gave it to hospitalized patients. They started using it in ICUs. Now, if we did that in Britain, actually now it's sort of irrelevant. I mean, we had less than 20 deaths in London last week. So it's kind of, but at the peak of this, if we did that in the UK, the monthly cost is less than the cost of 1 ventilator. And what the Americans have learned is you don't want to get people on ventilators.
Yeah.
Give them oxygen, but don't get them on ventilators. So what we've got here is something that's absolutely dirt cheap. It has way better science right now than any of the experimental drugs. It has absolutely no downside whatsoever. There's no risk in doing this. And it's the British bulldoggedness that just says, no, we don't believe in vitamins. We think it's irrelevant, it's old. And I get every day, I mean, for example, I was reading something from a very nice professor, Tim Spector, who's very, well recognized. I've met him. And, he just had this throwaway line, no evidence for vitamin C whatsoever. So I wrote to him and showed him, the tons of randomized controlled trials and all the rest of it. So it's actually the mindset. We've just got to get out. I mean, I had a friend recently or a few years ago who had a massive stroke and was in a coma for 2 months. And I was called in on the family meeting with everyone. Yeah. He had no exposure to sunlight for 2 months. And I said, is it possible that you would just test his vitamin D level? And if it's a problem, I've got a kit here, just a pinprick. I didn't want to say give vitamin D. I wanted to get it tested, because if it's tested and low, in a way they've got a response. This was the stroke recovery unit. So they specialize in stroke recovery, and they refused. And what is that mindset that is refusing? Crazy. What is that mindset that is refusing doing something for which there is evidence? There is absolutely no safety risk at all. I mean,
but they're doing it, like you say, in ICUs in New York,
in China, in America, in South Korea, in New Zealand. I think in some places.
Maybe it just we need to talk about rebranding it, because at the moment I think the positive thing coming out of apart from, I talked a few weeks ago with a good friend of mine, Jim Doty, about compassion, and a lot of people are showing each other compassion at the moment. But I think at the moment it could be a really good time to kind of rip up the old kind of manual and say to people, well, let's work with medicine and these nutrients and vitamins, and they can work together to help people, because
I think
it shouldn't be any it shouldn't be one death's bad. A friend of mine passed away from it. He was 58, and I don't think he would have He wouldn't have died from the flu, but he obviously, wasn't the fitness guy, I don't think. But,
well, we've had people whose husbands usually are.
Why men? Why men? Why is it more men get this?
I mean, there's a simple fact that 2/3 as many men have diabetes than women. So it could simply be to do with that. I mean, women are always more conscious about what they eat. Men have the attitude of it's irrelevant. I'll eat what I like, sort of thing. So, I mean, we've trained 10,000 nutritional therapists at our Institute for Optimum Nutrition, and they're nearly all women. I mean, we wish there were a lot more men who could then talk to men, but women, it's part of a woman's psyche to nourish and nurture and all that. So they're just involved, in that whole sort of, it's nearly always men sort of eat what the woman, tells them to eat. So anyway, but the thing is, we've had, people in critical condition where the wife has been begging, to give them some vitamin C, and they just won't. And then the usual rebuttal is, we can't do anything until there's a randomized controlled trial. So, for example, there's a very big multinational trial going on at the moment called REMAP-CAP, which is testing lots of drugs. So any hospital can sign up and say, I'm going to join this trial, testing this drug, following the guidelines.
What's it called again? What's it called?
It's called REMAP, REMAP-CAP.
Okay.
And they've added a vitamin C arm. So a hospital could choose to do that. But so far, and I've been contacting all the support organizations across the world who are involved in this, I know there's no hospital in Britain who have chosen to do that arm. But I've yet to find a hospital anywhere who has chosen to do the arm. So if you like, the mechanics is there. I don't know why that is, but there's a lot of money flying around right now. If you test my drug, I will pay you, X, Y, Z. I mean, it's the vaccine thing, not talking about whether it's good or bad or whatever, but, you've got, I mean, the other day, the Oxford, the results of the Oxford vaccine on monkeys came out. The Daily Mail said it was atrocious. It didn't work. And then the BBC said, it appears to have been very successful. So you get two completely different reports. Then you had the Moderna vaccine, and the initial press release said great results and the shares shot up. And then out came the actual report, which said 20% had a serious reaction, which required hospitalization, whatever. So what I'm trying to say is that suddenly around vaccines, around drugs, there's a lot of money, there's a lot of talk, there's a lot of...
But also there's a lot of risk, isn't it? You think they're trying to make a vaccine within the last, 6 to 8 weeks. And then you've got vitamins, which I'm not saying will replace a vaccine. Let's not talk about perhaps vaccines at the moment, but, this is years and years of evidence that they work. I mean, Patrick, you're 62, you look amazing. And it's not just vitamins, you eat the right diet. I mean, we haven't got that long today, and maybe we call this part one, because I think we should do a few more parts to this, but we've had a few questions from some of our members, and one of them was, there's an argument to say that we can get all the vitamins, nutrition from a good balanced diet.
Yeah.
Why would we therefore need supplements?
Well, this is the biggest lie, in nutrition, because then you say, do you eat a well-balanced diet? You go, well, yeah.
I think I do.
Yeah, I think I eat a well-balanced diet, So we know that most people believe, and then what is a well-balanced diet? And the answer is, a well-balanced diet is a diet that gives you all the vitamins you need. I had a classic on this. I actually went on TV with the head of the Dietetic Association. And it's a bit cheeky. I knew she doesn't like me at all. And we were going to talk about supplementation, right?
Why didn't she like you?
Well, I don't know why she doesn't like me. But anyway, what happened was, there we were sitting in the green room, before we went on, and I just got chatting and whatever. And I said, do you take any supplements? She said, well, yes, I do. I take an RDA multivitamin, right? So anyway, there we were in the TV studio. And I said, Catherine Collins, you represent the British Dietetic Association. do you believe you can get all the nutrients you need from a well-balanced diet, right? And she said, yes. Right. And I said, and do you, as chief dietitian, eat a well-balanced diet? And she said, yes, I do. And I said, and do you take any supplements? And she said, yeah, I take an RDA multivitamin. I said, well, why on earth would you do that? If you believe you get all the nutrients you need from a well-balanced diet, why on earth would you then want to take an RDA multivitamin? You can't cut it both ways. So the answer really is that it's just bollocks. If you want to know how much vitamin C, for example, or vitamin D, a few years ago, I wrote an article that said you cannot get all the vitamins you need from a well-balanced diet. Everyone needs to supplement vitamin D in the winter months.
Yeah.
And I got had up by the Advertising Standards Authority, which have a line that says you can never imply that you can't get all the nutrients you need. Now, I sent them all the science. It's not about the science. You've broken rule number 4. A few years later, the government announced everyone needs to supplement vitamin D.
I know.
So I'm afraid to say that
But they do, at least they do catch up with you, don't they? They catch up. But I think in a time like this, they need to be ahead of the game.
Yeah, and also the thing is, we are just individuals. So the British public are way ahead of e.g. government or NHS on the subject of vitamin C. Sales have gone through the roof. If you survey the public, many people are aware that when you've got a cold, have some more vitamin C. They put the money where the mouth is, so to speak.
Yeah.
So the public are ahead of the game. So I don't think that I can change the NHS or the government. I've been trying for 40 years, but I do think that I can change or influence an individual and their outcome on disease. So, when lockdown happened, the first thing I did was to sit down and write it. Here it is. It's all science-based. It tells you exactly what to do. And if I can reach, my goal every day is to reach 100 people, with straightforward, logic and science and something that you can practically do.
Patrick, can we just finish up then on what do you do yourself? What is your regime in terms of diet? You've told us about the vitamins you take.
Mm-hmm.
And what about all the other vitamins? Vitamin E, should we be taking all these other vitamins as well?
They're all in here,
All right.
So this costs me, it would cost you less than half a Starbucks a day, right? It costs me a bit less. I get a discount. But basically, I want my cells to always have an optimal supply of nutrients. I'll end with one slightly funny thing, but have you heard of telomeres?
Yes.
Telomeres. You've got, the DNA spiral, the chromosome you see with all those DNA strands. When you make a new cell, you have to copy it. And every time you copy the blueprint to make a new cell, there's a little bit at the end, which is like the hard bit at the end of your shoelace that gets 1 degree shorter. And that's called your telomeres. And when like
you're aging, it gets shorter.
Absolutely.
Is that right?
When you run out of sufficient telomere length, you can't make new cells. So it's the best biological predictor of death, right? So you can measure telomere length. This whole area has exploded. There are over 30,000 studies on telomeres in just a few years. Nobel Prizes have been won and all the rest of it. People are looking at what is associated with longer telomeres, shorter telomeres. You'll find everything that I'm doing. The more omega-3, longer telomeres. More vitamin D, longer telomeres. More B vitamins, longer telomeres. Supplement takers, longer telomeres. Exercises, longer telomeres. Less stress, longer telomeres. Better sleep, longer telomeres, etc., etc., etc. So when I hit 60, I thought I'm going to get my telomere length measured. So thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people have had their telomeres. So we know what the average 20-year-old telomere length is and the average 60-year-old. And my telomere length was the average of a 29-year-old.
How did you get it tested?
It's a blood test. Yeah, it's a blood test. It's not cheap. It's about, £300 or something. But
when you go on your retreats in Wales, do you offer all that as well for people?
we don't do the telomere test as, as such. That's kind of like a single thing. But on my retreats in Wales, I've got two kinds. I've got a 4-day retreat, starts on Friday, ends on Monday, which is called Total Health Transformation. And it's both mind and body, so we work on different factors. We have some meditations, some methods for reducing stress. I'm kind of teaching everything I've learned, which is not all about nutrition. So I've learned a lot more outside of nutrition. And then I have a 7-day retreat, which is based on the 5-day diet, which is 5 days of it. Then there's 2 days coming out of that and going on to the low GL diet. And in all of these, you make all the foods, we make them together, you learn everything, so you can leave knowing what to do for yourself. And on that one, we are measuring your glucose, your ketones, we're measuring certain things as you go through, which is great because you can actually sort of see what's happening in your own biochemistry. Our human body is just an incredible thing. And to just take, this should be taught in school, just to take a little bit of time to learn, get interested. And, the final thing is the vaccines are based on 2 premises. One is to boost your immune system's response against a virus.
Yeah.
So why not talk about what it is that boosts your immune system's strength? Things like vitamin D, vitamin C, zinc, and so on. And the negative effects of alcohol and stress and not sleeping and so on. The second is it's based on introducing herd immunity, where you get, at least 2/3, if not more, of the population producing antibodies against a specific virus. And vitamins, a stronger immune system means a better response to a vaccine.
So they can work with vaccines, even, they are going to produce a vaccine, but we need to be careful.
It's totally not an either or.
Yeah.
And you can't.
I'm not drinking red wine today either. I'm drinking water.
Yeah. It's early. But if you believe in vaccines, you believe in herd immunity.
Yeah.
And you believe in the power of your immune system to react. And those are the 2 fundamental things that are going to happen if you start to explore how do you support and boost your immune system. The flu vaccine has in some years been very ineffective. Last year was good, about 50% effective. The year before was bad, 10% effective in over 65-year-olds. Why worse in older people than younger people? Because their immune system is not so strong. If you don't have a fully functioning immune system, let's assume I had COVID-19. My immune system is strong. It sees the virus, it attacks, it responds, it will build antibodies. I'll test myself in 2 weeks because it takes a while. So the difference between a vaccine responder and a non-responder is actually the strength of the immune system. So it's illogical to spend all this money on vaccines that are going to be ineffective in people with weak immune systems, who are the people who are actually at risk of this.
Yeah.
And that brings you right back to who's actually dying or getting critically ill. What is different about those people to the people who aren't?
And how can we help those people? Boost their immune system.
Yeah. And if it turns out that diabetes is a big factor, it's reversible. And it doesn't cost much. It's so easy to save billions in the National Health Service. I've got 10,000 nutritional therapists. If every day 800 people are diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, every day 800 people are diagnosed with dementia, which is largely a preventable disease. If a doctor prescribed a type 2 diabetic, you've got to go and spend half a day on a workshop, which are run every week, and there's 10 places where they're run or whatever. You could literally hire 25 nutritional therapists to run mini workshops for diabetics to teach them what actually works with previous diabetics who've reversed it, seeing and tasting the foods, like having oats but adding some nuts. It's not difficult stuff. And people would feel empowered. They would see it working. They would try it out. It cuts not only the drug bill, but, if you sort out diabetes and dementia, my group at Oxford, headed by Professor David Smith, have now produced 73% less brain shrinkage and no further memory loss in people with pre-dementia by giving them sufficient B vitamins, especially B12, dirt cheap, non-patentable, plus enough omega-3. The biggest problem, unfortunately, that underlies all this is that none of these nutrients are patentable, none of them are profitable. And unfortunately, that, you know, who funds the studies, who funds the journals, how does it all work? And it's, if vitamins could be patented, or if drugs could not be patented, it would change things overnight.
Yeah, I agree with that.
You know, and that's the fundamental issue. We need governments to fund research on things that can't be profitable. No pharma company is going to fund research on vitamins.
But I think if you're, what you're talking about is changing the whole system, because all the PPE shortages, the ventilators, all that we've seen being played out on TV, you know, in New York with the Governor Cuomo, I thought he's brilliant. But if they had less people going to the hospitals and the doctors because they looked after their own health and took responsibility for it, they'd have a lot more money to spend on the essential kits that's going to save lives.
Well, totally. And I'm part of a group called the NHS Frontline Immune Support, and we've raised 20 grand, and we've now got over 500 doctors and nurses in ICU units that we supply vitamin C, vitamin D, zinc to. So, you know, we're putting it, they love it. They feel much better for it. They're getting less infections. We're doing what I hope the NHS, you know, would do in the future. If you're going to protect yourself from the outside, why not protect yourself from the inside? Think of the logic of it. If we know, and we do know, by the way, that of those critically ill, 55% have very low vitamin D. 2% of the critically ill have optimal vitamin D. Of those who get very mild infection, 98% have optimal vitamin D. I don't think a nurse or a doctor put into a high risk viral environment should be there unless they've had their vitamin D level checked and raised into the optimal range. That's PPE on the inside.
Yeah.
You know, these things are doable. But as my dear friend, Professor Robert Lustig in America says, these diseases, the majority of diseases from which we die, are not druggable, they're foodable. And until food is at the very top of the National Health Service, until nutrition is at the very top, nothing really is going to change. And at the moment, it's at the very bottom. And there lies the problem. Of course, I'm going to work on reaching as many people every day as I possibly can, because I think that that can save lives. But we do need, you know, this paradigm
change of thinking. We do need a change of thinking. As
Einstein said, you know, the definition of insanity is to keep doing the same thing and expect different results.
Patrick, you're doing a fantastic job. Listen, perhaps we'll do another conversation in the next few weeks. I'd love that. Talk about, you know, dementia perhaps, because I mean, COVID-19 is, you know, taken over the headlines, but dementia has been the biggest, you know, the biggest news story with health in the last couple of years.
No, and I mean,
I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as well.
Exactly. No, we should do that, because nobody wants to have their relative die of dementia. It's, you know, it's the terrible thing. And it's not necessary. And I'd love to talk about that. The science on that is impeccable.
Well, Patrick, thank you so much. Thank you so much. You go back now to saving the planet, and I'll speak to you very soon.
All right. All the best.
Cheers, buddy. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.